and welcome to this long anticipated, long requested, and long put off series from me. I am super excited to finally be diving into this. I've had many people ask me for a beginner watercolor tutorial series, and honestly I haven't felt inspired or ready to do that, but really the past couple of weeks I've just had so many things come into my mind like, oh, this would be great for beginners, oh, this would be a great way to start. And so now that I know that I have something of value to show you that isn't necessarily on other platforms, I'm ready to actually start this series. I'm super excited and I hope that you are too. Let's dive into this. All right, now the first thing we're going to do is just cover the basics of the tools that you need. We're not going to do any color mixing or actual painting in this tutorial, but I want to help you kind of pick and choose between which tools to use. We're going to talk about the types of paints there are, paintbrushes, and your physical palette as well. Okay, to start, your actual watercolors yourselves. There are three types of watercolors. There are pans, which is actually what I recommend starting with. So this is my first watercolor kit. A pan is a solid form of watercolor. It is pigment based, and you can get any kind of color that you want. They usually come in half pans or full pans, and they're a great resource for beginner watercolors. The great thing about them is they're super portable. All you need with a kit like this is a cup of water and a piece of paper, and that's what I loved about starting with this, is that it's usually you can get a good kit like this pretty affordably, and I'll have similar ones linked down below, though I've never been able to find this exact one again. I think that it's a great place to start off, and it's personally where I started off. And it's just like, it just doesn't feel like as much commitment as tubes, which is what we're going to talk about next. They are pigment based. They're really the same thing as tubes, except that it's been squirted into those little cups, basically. So the tube paint you can get in a larger size, which is nice if you use a certain color a lot. So this is sap green. I use it a lot. Spoiler alert, it will be in the list at the end. But these are basically the same. Again, they're pigment based, and they're pretty much the same as the pans, except that they're still wet. So when you open it up, it's still wet, it's ready to go, which can be really nice if you're going to paint something that is larger. So if you're working on a larger piece of paper or you're covering a large surface area, I definitely recommend getting a tube of paint, which is actually how I started on my tube collection, if you will, is that I had a commission piece that was huge. It was a lot larger than I had worked on before, and I didn't want to continue to be rubbing in the pan. Having it already wet, I didn't have to add water to activate it. It was just already ready to go, and I could have as much as I needed. So all I had to do was dip my big brush in, add some water, and start painting instead of continuing to massage, going back for more paint, going back for more paint. There is more waste with tubes, usually, because you don't know, with a pan, you're able to get just what you need out, and even though it can be annoying to go back and forth, you're just getting what you need. But with a tube, you might pour out more than you need, and when you clean off your palette, there goes money down the drain. So it's just one of those things that usually if you're moving to tubes, you're comfortable with that risk. Tubes by ounce are actually cheaper, even though they are more expensive per color. By ounce, they are cheaper than getting a pan. So if you are ready to start investing in watercolor, go ahead and go with the tubes. But between pans and tubes, I would say that there's no wrong answer. Now, the third form of watercolor, it's not actually watercolor, but it does fall into this category, and people will use it interchangeably with watercolor painting, are liquid watercolors. And as the name suggests, it is liquid form. It is dye-based though, so it actually dyes the paper. Instead of where pigment-based, it sits on top a little bit more. It does bleed into the paper, but it's just very different. The liquid watercolor, it just dyes the paper, and so you can't pick it up or do other watercolor techniques like you can with pans or with tubes. And so it's just not as versatile, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it until you've had more experience. They are highly pigmented. They're great for if you're scanning things or if you're working with flat color a lot. But again, there's just different things that you can do with watercolors, especially fixing mistakes or different watercolor techniques, getting different textures with watercolor that you can't do with liquid watercolors, at least not very well. So they're great for certain things, but I wouldn't dive into them, definitely not as a beginner. And I haven't really played with them because they're scary to me. They're a lot of commitment, but they can be a lot of fun. If you're interested, go ahead and do some more research on that. All right, next let's dive into brushes. Now I actually have a recommendation that isn't super popular in the art community, especially in the watercolor community. I actually don't recommend starting with watercolor brushes. I have this kit from Artify that I have found to be, I mean, I still use it. It's been great. It is what I would call an all-purpose brush, where it could be used with acrylics. They're stiffer bristles, but they do work with watercolor. But there's a little bit more control because they don't hold as much watercolor. And especially when you're starting off with watercolor, it can be really difficult to know how to control all of the water. So I found that these brushes have been the best for beginners, as opposed to what I use now, which is a watercolor brush. These are the Princeton Neptune watercolor brushes. They hold a lot of water, and let me tell you, they are a treat to use. But again, I still go back to these sometimes because sometimes I just need a little bit more control. I use these for mixing paint because they're not as delicate as my my watercolor brushes, and so having both in your kit, but starting with this this kind of all-purpose. I'll have this kit linked down below. This has been great. It also has, the nice thing about this kit is it comes with a bunch of different styles of brushes. I personally only use round brushes, like pretty much only. I have a quill brush, and I do use a flat brush sometimes, but my husband is also an artist. He exclusively uses flat brushes. So like, it's just because it's something that I like to use doesn't mean it's something that you'll love to use. So having a kit with some variety in there that's a little bit easier to use because it doesn't soak up the water as much and it doesn't disperse as much water on your paper will be helpful for you as a beginner. So I would start with a kit. These are also really affordable. Another reason why I recommend them. It's not a treat to use like this, but it is good quality. All right, the next thing I want you to do is buy a whole pad of paper. Again, I do have a video that I will be sharing at the end of this tutorial, which talks about like just working through my, a new medium, which watercolor is. If you're watching this video, watercolor is your new medium. Buy a whole pad of paper to burn. I love the Strathmore 300 watercolor series. It's what I learned on. Their 400 series I actually don't like, even though it's supposed to be nicer. But it's really affordable, especially as far as paper goes. If you do want to get really serious with your art and you're like, you know what, I just want to skip to the cotton paper, Arches watercolor paper is fabulous. It has a cult following for a reason. I do use it, but again, I always go back to this. Part of it is because I learned on this, and so if you think that you're going to be using Arches later, invest in Arches now. So paper is one of those things that it responds differently to watercolor. So as you're learning watercolor, if you want to use Arches later, invest in a pad of Arches paper. Have that to burn, make sure that you're able to just kind of experiment and play with that, and then move on. But again, I love this paper, it's affordable. I have never had a client complain if they get a piece on this paper. So, your artwork will speak for itself, even if the watercolor paper is not the most expensive paper in the world. You can get hot press or cold press watercolor paper. Hot press simply means that it's smooth, and cold press or rough means that there is some texture to it. I generally use the cold press paper for looser styles and some detail styles, and then I like the hot press for something that's a little bit more realistic and detailed. All right, last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about the palette. So this is the last of the tools, then we'll move into the fun stuff, the color. Some artists will say that you need to have something that is ceramic or porcelain. This is plastic. It works great for me. I never had any complaints. If you're wanting to experiment with ceramic, just get a dish from your kitchen. If you're going with tubes and you know that you want a lot of colors and you really want to go big on this, this is my beloved palette. So it is plastic, it is cheap, it is lightweight, and it is a beast, and I love it for that. In fact, my paint just fell out of it. But I have a lot of color on here. I have a lot of mixing area. So this is a piece that I'm working on. I can keep my water on the palette. I have paints over here that I don't use as often. One thing that I do recommend doing though, whether you're using plastic or ceramic, which is what I'm going to be experimenting with in this tutorial series, with any new palette, you don't know if there's any oils on it or any debris or just any yuckiness on it. You want to wash that off with just some gentle dish soap, rinse it off really well before you start using that. I did that with my large palette, and I've never had any trouble with the paint like pilling on me or pulling or like just behaving strangely, which other people have complained about. But I do think it is because they didn't properly prepare their palette beforehand. And again, this was created probably in a factory. I don't know what it was around, and I probably don't want that in my paint. because it could mess up my paint. It could, you know, like what if it had a chemical in it that messed with my colors? I don't want that in my painting. So in order to avoid that altogether, I've just washed it off and prepared it beforehand. So regardless of what you use, whether it's plastic, I'll have this beauty linked down below, or ceramics, again, linked down below. I really think that the biggest, I don't think it matters, but I think the biggest thing you can do is prepare it beforehand so that it's ready to be used. All right, my light for the day is starting to fade, which tells me that I've been talking for way too long. Now that we've gone over the tools, I want you to head over to my 3 tips for a new medium video. This is a video that I highly recommend exploring and playing around with before you dive into the next video in this series, before you even start with like actually breaking down your color mixing and kind of exploring more. The best thing that you can do is explore these tips and kind of really create a strong foundation, become a little bit more familiar with your watercolor paints, and you know, you're able to start off that next step, your actual homework tutorial, with a lot more confidence. I hope that you found the information in this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and share it with one of your friends, or leave a comment down for me below. And until next time, happy painting. Camera is shaking.